Back in January, we welcomed a Dr. Benjamin Schmitt to Beyond the Reefs for an eye-opening conversation on the growing threats to undersea communication cables. At the time, Taiwan had just experienced suspected sabotage off its northern coast, one of several similar incidents involving Chinese vessels in both the Indo-Pacific and the Baltic Sea. Today, we pick up part two of our conversation with Dr. Benjamin Schmitt, and we want to continue our conversation about a new report that him and his team at Climate Center for Energy Policy and Perry Worldhouse put together called Underwater Mayhem, which outlines a troubling pattern of suspected sabotage and maritime manipulation by authoritarian states like Russia and China. Now, this is about ships that go around the sea and basically break cables that connect the internet, electricity, or gas pipelines between countries. It's a new domain of geopolitical competition unfolding beneath the waves. Hi, you're listening to Beyond the Reefs, a show produced by Radio Taiwan International. Here we talk about socioeconomic issues that are faced by Taiwan and their broader impact around the world beyond the reefs of this island nation. As we continue our conversation with Dr. Benjamin Schmitt today, we feel the need to define a few things before we move forward. First up, a lot of what we're discussing, sabotaging underwater cables, is considered what many would call gray zone tactics or gray zone warfare. And for that reason, we feel the need to first define the term. And for those who are employing gray zone tactics or gray zone warfares, what's the goal?
Well, we actually spend quite a bit of time at the first section of the first chapter, as it were, of the report, going into the terminology. You think, okay, that sounds pretty boring, but in fact, it's pretty key to the policy responses that come out of this. And so oftentimes you hear language like gray zone threats or gray zone actions, hybrid threats or hybrid actions, hybrid activities, or hybrid warfare. And what we talk to more and more experts about is, okay, let's say we want to define what that is in general. Gray zone or a hybrid activity is generally considered an activity that includes anything from cyber attacks to physical sabotage to disinformation campaigns and strategic communications campaigns and everything in between that can undermine and erode democratic resilience across democracies, do nefarious and malign activities, and have that undermine Western democracies in a way that is considered sub-threshold of a military response. And so in the European case, oftentimes you think, okay, NATO, does this reach NATO Article 5?
Yeah, by the way, I should just quickly cover for people who are not familiar with NATO's Article 5. It's basically, it says that an attack on one NATO member is considered an attack against all, but exactly what constitutes as an attack, I think for Taiwan, especially having lived next to a neighbor that's consistently threatened us for decades, we've long understood that if there ever was going to be an attack coming from China, it probably won't take form in the conventional military strategies, but more so in what you were just talking about, the gray zone tactics or hybrid warfare.
You know, oftentimes we know for a fact it hasn't, because NATO hasn't declared Article 5 in response to any of these incidents. But we talked to a number of experts, including someone who really, really knows and has thought deeply about these issues, General Ben Hodges, former U.S. Army Europe commander. And General Hodges often says, you know, he doesn't like these sort of terms because they're quote unquote fuzzy, and that in reality, Russia is at war with us. These are acts of war by Russia. It's whether we on our side want to call it that. You know, that constrains the sort of political and military and, you know, intelligence and all society responses we have to these sort of incidents. And so the faster that we understand these to be acts of war that don't necessarily require a military response, the better it will be. And one of the examples I have, Joey, in something that I've called for years, and we've put as the number one policy recommendation in this first report, in the first volume of this series, is that NATO in Europe should declare Article 4, not Article 5, but Article 4, that would allow for a publicly recognized consultative mechanism that's on the books, that basically allowing for member states of NATO who have had Russian actors or non-Russian nationals that have been shown to be recruited by Russia's military intelligence, the GRU, over various social media platforms like Telegram to basically hire people to do a little bit of sabotage or for a little bit of money, or I call the dirty deeds done dirt cheap strategy of Putin
Right.
across Europe,
Yeah.
for all you AC/DC fans out there.
Yeah.
It's really important to remember that these have been attributed, and so we already know these are happening inside of NATO territory. Why haven't we had NATO Article 4, which says if a member state feels that its sovereignty is being pressured in this way, that there's a consultative mechanism. And the reason is political. There are countries in the NATO alliance that don't want to, quote unquote, escalate vis-a-vis Russia, and they believe that declaring Article 4 will do just that. But we need to call a spade a spade. That's the only way we can get to real deterrence, and we still haven't done that. Nevertheless, on a professional level, NATO has done a tremendous job, right? They don't have maybe the political top cover of an Article 4, but they're taking this seriously. They've started a critical subsea infrastructure protection cell at NATO headquarters in Brussels. They've started an operational center to counter subsea sabotage at Marcom in London. And then, of course, they have NATO Baltic Sentry, which has been going on. It's an actual NATO Operation Baltic Sentry, that has been basically going around using NATO military and security assets around the Baltic Sea to deter would-be saboteurs from actually breaking cables and things like this. And Joey, we saw this just this week in the Baltic Sea. There was a report that the Polish Air Force, followed by the Polish Navy, were basically able to view and then go out and deter a sanctioned Russian shadow fleet vessel. These vessels that are carrying Russian oil against sanctions. This vessel, called the Sun, which was flagged in, I believe, in Antigua, but certainly connected to Russia, has been sanctioned by the EU. It was basically doing all sorts of strange maneuvers, and I looked at its AIS signal yesterday, going through the Baltic Sea like normal, suddenly turned 90 degrees, sailed south, and started going up and down for 48 hours or so, a electricity cable connecting Poland and Sweden. And the Poles were rightfully concerned about this sort of very strange activity by an oil tanker directly over this piece of critical infrastructure, and they didn't want to see a potential, quote unquote, accident of a anchor drag or something to break this cable. And so they sent military assets out and got this vessel to depart. And now that vessel is departed, and I believe is reached Ust-Luga in the Russian Federation, where it was headed originally, and nothing had been broken. So actions are being taken, but we still need that political top cover with Article 4.
So what do you think in terms of what Russia is doing to the rest of the world and what China might be doing around Taiwan? Is there a difference between the two? And if so, this show wants to focus more on the socioeconomic impact of what's happening in Taiwan. What is the socioeconomic impact of cutting these subsea cables for a country like Taiwan?
Well, look, it's huge, Joey, and the geography just isn't in Taiwan's favor when it comes to protecting, subsea cables, because it's an island, right? So it's not as if you then have, even on a peninsula where, you have a lot of dependence on subsea cables, but you still have land coverage as well, things like this. So I think any God forbid, any military contingency where the PRC was to try to, invade or attack Taiwan, one of the first things that would happen, and I think this is fairly wide consensus in the security policy community, would be trying to cut and sever all of those cables around Taiwan that would allow Taiwan to have, high-speed internet connection to the outside world. And so oftentimes people talk about, well, we can have satellite internet now, and that's great. Well, that's true, but it is not a panacea to the high bandwidth that we have with subsea cables. Remember, about 99% of all internet traffic still goes through subsea cables, right? So it's the bandwidth that you have is way, way higher. And so when we see these sort of incidents that have happened 3 times at least, and there may be more, but 3 high-profile incidents, 2023 through 2025, just a few weeks ago with the Pangu Islands case, it's it's pretty clear that China may be setting up a precedent for rehearsing for some sort of larger scale cuts if it were to happen in the future. I don't know that. I want to make it very clear to the audience. I don't have any crystal ball that says that I know what the PRC is going to do in the future, but I think certainly that's one of the elements of this. And one of the elements of this as well is undermining democratic resilience. It's the PRC trying to message to the people of democratic Taiwan that we can reach out and break these sort of cables. And this is just a warning if there were a larger scale incident that we could continue to cut these. And it's hard. It's hard to protect distributed infrastructure. We're talking about thousands of kilometers of cable and pipeline and all these sort of things. But there's a lot that you can still do. And I think that one of the cases, you mentioned Russia and China, I think Russia is trying to do what it's doing in Northern Europe to undermine European support for Ukraine, number one, and also just to undermine democratic resilience more broadly as part and parcel to what they've been doing for almost 20 years under the Putin regime, to undermine confidence and spread chaos and confusion in Western societies. I think that this no limits partnership between Xi and Putin only shows that there is likely, a potential benefit of Chinese vessels. That we'll talk about this in volume 2 of the reports, but in many of these later cases, more recent cases, they've been Chinese flagged vessels or Chinese owned vessels that have been involved in cable cutting in the Baltic Sea region. And now we see that, in some of these cases, Russia was escorting some of these vessels, right? And so there's, I think, a growing technical motivation. The Baltic Sea is a target-rich environment. It's shallow and it's relatively dense, as I said, with cables. In the Chinese case, a location that they find to be more strategic around the Taiwan Strait. And we'll see what happens. And there's got to be more attention on this as we go forward, that these aren't kind of one-off incidents. These are really core to any national security strategy going forward.
Yeah, I got to say, for the lack of a better word, it's ludicrous that this is allowed. Yeah. Something that is just sub-threshold, I think that's the term that you used, right? These activities, you can't quite yet do anything about it based on the policy framework internationally that we have. For example, Taiwan right now is going through, with Chinese fleets basically penetrating our ADIZ consistently, and it seems to be nothing we can do about it unless we want to escalate the situation. However, it is an invasion of sorts, and even more so ludicrous is the fact that they're basically rehearsing how to take over your territory. And the more they do so, the more they're going to have an experience in actually carrying that out. And thirdly, it's normalizing this kind of behavior so that there's less cognitive awareness of defense for the people who are living in that area.
Right.
So we're going to turn to the solution side. I think it's more twofold. So one is, are there early warning systems that are being proposed globally to detect this sort of gray zone activities? And the second fold is whether or not there are policies that will support some sort of actions for it. As we talked about, NATO's Article 4 could be implemented, but are there something like that that's being discussed?
Yeah, I think that's something that we talk about a lot towards the policy recommendation side of the report. Obviously, our first and foremost recommendation is NATO member states should invoke Article 4. We've talked about that, so I'll move right on, but that absolutely is the most important. Secondly, in the European case, the European Union should continue to phase out Russian energy imports and take measures to ensure that there cannot be a so-called return to energy business as usual with Putin's Russia on energy or critical infrastructure investments. They've weaponized energy and infrastructure investments against Europe for far too long, and this really cannot continue, especially in these circumstances. Then there's the fact that disinformation oftentimes comes hand in hand with these incidents. And so we've seen in the European case that Russian disinformation campaigns associated with suspected European energy and critical infrastructure attacks have happened. And they need to be countered by consistent, early, and transparent strategic communication strategies by European authorities. I think that, in particular, Finland and Estonia have really put together a playbook for the rest of the world on how to get out ahead of authoritarian nations that are carrying out these attacks, getting an edge in the information space and trying to spread disinformation or point the blame in a variety of different directions or even contradictory directions to spread doubt and things like this, and who actually is behind these. So I think strategic communications has to be a part of this. More effort needs to be placed on creating cross-competency coordination on European energy and critical infrastructure. That means more experts talking to each other across various government, public, private entities, and the expert community and the academic community to come to more rapid conclusions on how we actually counter these. We also think that transatlantic political and commercial leaders should take steps to support the wider development and coordination of open source intelligence monitoring technology, hardware, and data analysis tools. One of the things that certainly can help, I think, in this case is AI. We're going to dive into AI in the Volume 2 report that we're working on. AI can help with vessel identification using machine algorithms to understand if a vessel is seen on satellite, but it doesn't have its identification on with AIS. Through the magic of machine learning and AI, identify which vessel that is. There are firms that are working on this, including one that I partnered with for what will be Volume 2. I would be surprised if there were not folks working on algorithms right now to parse AIS data of, the dense amount of global maritime traffic, of which the data is, it's not infinite, but it's a significant data set, obviously, to look at, this is how this vessel normally operates, and all of a sudden it's doing something very, very strange around critical infrastructure. Should we worry about that? So that's coming in Volume 2. One of the things we talk about in Volume 1, though, that we think needs to happen is having more commercial satellite data density, data richness directly over maritime environments where critical infrastructure lies on the seabed. It costs a lot of money for commercial satellite operators like Planet and Maxar and others to take images, from orbit, transfer that data, and then store that data. And if there's not a clear market for that, I mean, these are companies after all, then they won't necessarily prioritize having that data saved and ready to go. And 70% of the Earth is covered in water. So you can look at the economics of that right away. However, if commercial subsea pipeline and telecommunications and electricity cable operators and things like these go out and say, look, we don't need the entire Baltic Sea covered in that level of data richness, but we have our Baltic Connector pipeline, or we have our S-Link 2 cable, or our NordBalt cable, right? And we know where those are. We will buy every single day images, as many as you can give us, of that zone, very small, relatively small zone where those pieces of infrastructure are. I think that is a big part, because the more images you have, the more chance you have to identify who was behind one of these attacks. And of course, that can lead to deterrence on its own right.
Yeah, just from the data collection side, like you said, you guys collect satellite data, AIS tracking, and then field interviews. It's a combination of different sources, which at this point is probably not highly effective, or is not fast enough to collect information. So we certainly need to invest in this. And that's the data collection side. There's also the enforcement, right? I mean, There might need to be a task force put together, just shooting from the hip, Tom Cruise's impossible mission force for the ocean, to protect it. But what's the cost of it? I guess.
Joey, I'm going to stop you right there. You talked about Mission Impossible. Everyone knows today is the day Mission Impossible 8 comes out. And if you've seen I haven't seen the film yet, but I will see it this weekend. The trailer includes a scene or scenes that they actually produced on Svalbard at the Svalsat station, which is where our first case study takes place in the Underwater Mayhem project. So I don't want to say that the Underwater Mayhem report is in any way in the Mission Impossible universe, but certainly if you watch the film and are interested in about real life national security related incidents that are taking place in and around Svalbard, you can read our report to see what that looks like.
Well, there you go. So there's a little bit of pop culture ties to get people to be more intrigued in this.
There you go.
So Benjamin, thank you so much for spending the time to speak with us. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Once again, the report put together by Dr. Benjamin Schmitt and his team called Underwater Mayhem. We'll be linking it in our show notes. Thanks again for joining us here on Beyond the Reefs.